So what this fancier analysis of the political system tells you is that you ought to expect a pattern in the political marketplace. And the pattern you ought to expect is that that marketplace will tend to redistribute from dispersed interest groups to concentrated interest groups, that it will have some bias in favor of efficient laws. The bigger the gain, the larger the support, the smaller the loss, the smaller the opposition, but it will be perfectly happy to do inefficient redistribution, to have laws that produce $10 billion of gain for $100 billion of loss, provided the gainers are enough more concentrated than the losers. And that prediction, I think, fits what we observe. The classic example being tariffs. The economics of tariffs was worked out by David Ricardo a little less than 200 years ago. Most economists accept the analysis. One implication of the analysis is that with a few rare exceptions, tariffs hurt the countries that impose them. The US is shooting itself in the foot every time it imposes a tariff. Nonetheless, with two notable exceptions, no polity, no state in the history of the last 200 years has actually abolished its tariffs. The only two exceptions I know about, at least, are Great Britain in the 19th century and Hong Kong, which wasn't really an independent state in the 20th century. They were both startlingly successful economies. But why doesn't anybody else do it? Because a tariff is economically a loss, but it's politically a gain. Because a tariff transfers income to a domestic producing industry, and domestic producing industries are a relatively concentrated interest group, at the expense of domestic consumers and all export industries. Hence, we observe that pattern. Gary Becker has a sort of an interesting rule of thumb with regard to farm policy, which is that the world is divided into two kinds of countries. There are countries where the farmers are a very small fraction of the population, like the US and Europe. And in those countries, the purpose of farm policy is to raise the price of farm goods, to raise the price of food in order to buy the political support of the concentrated agricultural interest. And then there are poor countries where the farmers are a very large part of the population. And in those countries, the purpose of farm policy is to drive down the price of food in order to buy the support of the urban mob at the expense of the dispersed peasantry. I think New Zealand is the counterexample. I think New Zealand neither subsidizes nor specially taxes its agriculture, but that's experimental error, if you like. But it's a pretty good rule, nonetheless. So we can go on to other examples. If you think about, for example, one of the standard claims that people attacking the market make is that it's short-sighted, that we've got a plan for the future, and that corporations are only interested in tomorrow's bottom line. But that's exactly backwards. Because suppose you think about why rational people will or won't do long-term planning. So imagine that you're thinking about planting hardwoods, black walnuts, for example. Very pretty wood, but it's a slow-growing tree. And you say to yourself, my estimate is that if we plant these black walnuts now, in 40 years they'll be ready for harvest, and they will be worth a good deal more than it cost us to grow them. Should I do it? Well, wait a minute, I'm 65. And your first is to say, no, I'm going to be dead before they're ready for harvest. Say, wait a minute, that's not right. Because after all, if I plant them today when I'm 65, 10 years from now when I'm 75, I can go out on the marketplace and say, would anybody like to buy a large field full of 10-year-old black walnut trees? They are only 30 years from harvest now. And somebody else will buy them from me. And he will keep them for another 20 years, let's say, and then he needs some money. And so he sells 30-year-old black walnut trees almost ready to be harvested. And the result is that it is in my selfish, rational self-interest to plan well beyond my lifetime, because the project that I start now can be transferred for money to somebody else later. There is, however, a critical condition that has to be met in order for this to work, and that's secure property rights. Suppose we tell the same story, except that each year there is a significant chance, let us say 5% chance, 1 chance in 20, that either some private thief will drive onto my forest late at night and cut down my trees and take them out. That'll only be in the last 10 years or so, probably, when they're worth cutting down. Or else that some government will decide that black walnut trees are a national resource, and therefore seize them. If there is a significant chance year by year of my losing control of my property, that's an incentive for not doing long-term planning. Or putting it differently, if we imagine that the return that makes me willing to make the investment is, say, 5%, if there is a 5% chance each year of losing the property, the return has got to be about 10% a year before it makes sense to do it, because half of that on average I'm losing by the property being seized. All right. So that tells me that what you need for long-term planning are secure property rights. And one of the problems with at least our political systems is that politicians have very insecure property rights. As I used to say during a previous administration, Clinton can rent out the White House, but he can't sell it. That if you're a politician and you do something which is politically expensive this year, but will produce large visible benefits 20 years from now, you are very foolish. Because the voters, due to rational ignorance, won't reward you this year because they have no way of knowing that those benefits in 20 years are going to happen. And 20 years from now, when the benefits happen, the person who is then president will say, look what a good president I am. Look at all these wonderful things happening. You will get no benefit at all. So if you generalize that argument, you can see that rational politicians will be short-sighted. That rational politicians will be interested in the effect of their policies at the next election. Maybe the election after that, but not much beyond that. That if I can do something that will be very popular for the next few years and a catastrophic failure 15 years from now, go right ahead. It's going to be a great political success. Right? That, of course, is part of the problem with things like Social Security, that there's an incentive to try to push problems off to the future when somebody else will have to deal with them. So that's another example of a form of market failure, in this case due to insecure property rights, leading to things being short-sighted. Another example that probably you're all familiar with is the problem of drug regulation. I'm thinking now of legal drugs, of medical drugs. That if you're in the FDA and you let another thalidomide go by, your career is over. In fact, the whole agency may be over. It may be replaced with some new and supposedly better agency. If you're in the FDA and you postpone for 2 years a drug that would have saved, let us say, 10,000 lives a year, you've just killed 20,000 people, but they're all invisible. They're all statistical corpses. And you will suffer no penalty. And my standard example I usually give of this is the case of beta blockers. This is one where I think my father in one of his Free to Choose shows back before the FDA approved beta blockers gave them as an example of a case where a useful drug, beta blockers, are used to prevent a second heart attack. And they were widely in use outside of the US, and for a period of, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, something like that, the US FDA did not approve of their use for that purpose. And at least one of the drugs involved was already being used for other purposes, so it wasn't an argument about it being a dangerous drug, but they had not been adequately persuaded that it was effective. When the FDA finally decided to approve a beta blocker, their press release predicted that this would save, I think their figure was 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year. I like to describe that as the FDA press release admitting to killing 100,000 people. But of course that wasn't how it got reported, and from the standpoint of an FDA administrator, those 100,000 people are a whole lot cheaper than 10,000 people killed by the side effects of a drug that they chose to approve that turned out to be dangerous. So from that standpoint, you can see that in this case the problem is an imperfect information problem. Imperfect information not in the FDA, but in the people who are judging the FDA, the voters, again leads to a predictable mistake of killing with caution. And you can think without any difficulty of other examples. The basic point I'm trying to make, however, is that while market failure is a real problem and a real problem on private markets, it is, as it were, the exception on private markets and the rule on public markets. Because on the political marketplace, almost all decisions individuals make are ones where most of the costs and most of the benefits go to other people. If you vote for a congressman who votes for the current health care bill, whether that's a good or bad thing, the effects are dispersed among 300 million Americans. So you have no incentive to make sure that you're voting the right way.